All right, welcome back for the second part of oxidative phosphorylation. We just finished the electron transport chain, and now we need to get to chemiosmosis. So I kind of erased everything so we can start afresh and review a little bit of the electron transport chain before we get into chemiosmosis. So remember that all of oxidative phosphorylation occurs in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So let's just set the stage one more time. So here's our inner membrane. Remember, it's a phospholipid bilayer. And here's the matrix. We've got our inner membrane. And you have the inner membrane space. All right, so we're really zoomed into the mitochondrial inner membrane space. Now let's redraw those four protein complexes of the electron transport chain. So you have these more complexes. And I'm keeping some space down here for a reason. So leave some space there if you're taking notes on this as well. We've got protein complex 1, protein complex 2, 3, and 4, and you got this little guy on top of 2. All right. So remember, in the matrix, NADH and FADH2 are dropping their electrons off at protein complex 1 and protein complex 2. So these electrons are traveling through, and at the very end, oxygen pulls them through with its electronegativity and makes water. So hanging out in the matrix, this is where we need to focus our energy right now. No pun intended, because we're making energy. So we have some protons just hanging out in the matrix. Not as much as we have tons of protons in the inner membrane space, actually. The way the mitochondrial chemistry is, when protons are made, they get shipped to the inner membrane space really well. So we get tons of protons up here. So we have a very high concentration of protons in the inner membrane space. Meaning, if I have a high concentration, so I have a high proton concentration, that's equal to a very low pH, meaning it's acidic. The more protons I have, the more acidic the surroundings, the solution I'm in. So a high proton concentration equals a acidic condition and a low pH. That kind of language you got to be very familiar with and go back and forth with it a lot. So the opposite holds true. If I have a low proton concentration like I do in the matrix, it's basic and it's a high pH. So the pH world is kind of opposite what you would think, but it works. So automatically, once the nature of the mitochondria, you have what we call a proton gradient that exists between the matrix and the inner membrane. So we have this proton gradient. And that's important because that's going to be doing a lot of action right now. So let's go back really quickly to the electron transport chain. If you remember, we got our electrons. I'm just going to put E. You don't need to put numbers on here anymore. So our electrons are going to go through, and they're going to go down the side, and eventually they're going to make, your electrons are going to come out, and you're going to get tons of water because you got oxygen in there as well. So that's a brief summary of the electron transport chain that we studied last time. Now, here's what I want you to remember, or imagine in your head. Imagine the kid who is the electron. They have super long, stretchy arms, kind of like Elastigirl. And as they go down the electron transport chain, down the slide, they're able to reach down, and below them on the slide is a huge flower garden. So as they're going down the slide, they're going to reach down, pluck up some flowers, and throw them into the air. And as they keep going down the slide, they're going to reach down, pick up some flowers, and throw them into the air. They do that a few times as they go down the slide, because kids do things like that, especially if they have super long, stretchy arms. So what these electrons are actually doing, as they're rolling down the slide, as these electrons are going through the chain, they actually generate a whole lot of energy. There's a lot of energy within an electron. And the energy that's made as these are going down the slide, it's allowing these proteins to change shape to allow hydrogen, these protons, to actually get propelled across the inner membrane into the inner membrane space. These protons actually don't want to propel against the gradient. It's from low to high. That's active transport. We talked about that last time with cellular membranes and the whole sodium-potassium pump and all that stuff. But we don't want to use ATP to do this active transport. We're trying to make ATP, not use it. So instead of using our cellular energy source, ATP, these electrons are actually allowing these proteins to move in a way that they can grab these protons and bloop, shoot them up across the inner membrane space. So as these electrons are traveling through the slide, the electron transport chain, they're going to grab a proton and shoot them up. So you're going to have another proton up here. Protein complex 2 can't do it. It's too small. But 3 and 4 can. So as the electrons are traveling through, whoosh, shoots that proton up. Same thing with 4. It's going to grab a proton and whoosh, push it back up. Now you still have some protons down here, but it's a low concentration. What these protons naturally want to do now is go back down their gradient. They want to take the path of least resistance and just roll right down. Enter the coolest enzyme ever. Towards the end of the electron transport chain, you have another protein complex here. This is where the chemiosmosis part really starts going. This enzyme is called ATP synthase. And what ATP synthase does, it's in the name, it actually synthesizes ATP. And I kid you not, it kind of looks like this. It's a protein channel. And it has like this doorknob region on the end here too. So here's what ATP synthase does. All of these protons go down ATP synthase because ATP synthase is actually a proton channel. And as these protons are traveling down ATP synthase, remember, whenever a protein interacts with something, there's this conformational change. It changes its shape. Here's the cutest part of ATP synthase. As these protons are going down the proton channel, this knob region, this like doorknob region, actually starts to turn like a little mill. And what it does is it grabs an ADP, which is used up cellular energy, and another phosphate, puts them together and creates ATP. So every time a proton goes down ATP synthase, it makes it do this dance, if you will, to grab an ADP and a phosphate, puts them together, creates ATP. It's constantly doing this dance all day long as you're breathing in oxygen, so these electrons can go through, protons can get propelled, and then go back down again. That's kind of the reason you're breathing right now, so this process can happen. It's beautiful. So all of these protons eventually are just going to line up and they're going to go down ATP synthase. These protons remain in the matrix and get shot back up again too. But here's the important part. The whole point of ATP synthase is that as this knob is turning, it's going to allow it to basically open its arms so ADP and a phosphate can come in, and as it turns, it puts them together and it releases them into ATP. So ADP and a phosphate go into ATP synthase and come out ATP. Remember, ADP is adenosine diphosphate. We want triphosphate. So adding another phosphate turns it into triphosphate. Boom, you get tons of energy. And this whole process, you're going to create about 34 molecules of ATP from one glucose. It's gorgeous. So that's the process we're trying to do here. That is chemiosmosis. So the things I want you to remember about chemiosmosis is that you have a proton gradient established across the inner membrane. It is low proton concentration in the matrix. high in the intermembrane space. This whole process of the electrons propelling the protons across the membrane, that's actually called the proton motive force. That's a very fancy word. So you got your proton motive force. And it's established from the electron transport chain. And then lastly, ATP synthase. Which is an enzyme because it ends in ase, right? And which is also a proton gradient, and I'm sorry, proton channel, makes ATP. That is the whole reason we do this. It's gorgeous. So let's recap oxidative phosphorylation really quickly. So NADH and FADH2 drop their electrons off, and there's protons in the matrix, a ton of protons in the intermembrane space. Those electrons travel through the electron transport chain. But while the electron transport chain is happening, chemiosmosis is at the same time. This is a part of chemiosmosis. These protons get propelled against their gradient into the intermembrane space thanks to the proton motive force that gets established by these electrons as they travel through the electron transport chain. These protons get consistently propelled into this high concentration, and they want to come back down to a low concentration, so they enter this proton channel called ATP synthase. And as they're going down the channel, a conformational change happens in ATP synthase to grab an ADP and a phosphate, allow them to react together to make ATP. That's the phosphorylation part. Here's the chemi-phosphorylation. So that's like the whole, we get all these kinds of beautiful things that's going on here. And in the process of the electron transport chain, we're making water, and that's a big deal too. So that is the last step of cellular respiration. So really quickly, let's review really quickly so we could kind of understand everything we just kind of did. So in your notes, if you want to, rewrite another mitochondria, because this is all about the mitochondria, and this is the organelle that's allowing us to do this so well. So, one more recap, because now, that first time we drew that mitochondria with all the 3 different phases on there, those were all new words to you. Now you know the language, and so now we could kind of put it into practice. So if I got a mitochondria, and I got my inner membrane. All right. It's all right. So now I got my, I'm on the cytosol. All right. First step that happens is glycolysis. And remember, that is 1 glucose getting turned into 2 pyruvate molecules. And in the process, you're making some ATP, just a little bit. You're making 2 ATPs, if you remember correctly. And also remember that in this whole process, we're making our electron carriers. So during glycolysis, we're also making 2 NADHs. I'm putting some values on it now, so it actually becomes a little bit more legit. And that's going to go into the mitochondria. These 2 pyruvate, whoosh, enter the matrix. The 2 pyruvate are going to become 2 acetyl-CoAs, and that's going to kickstart the citric acid cycle. In the process, you're going to make 6 CO2s, total of 6 CO2s. You're going to make a total of 2 ATPs. But also, you got your electron carriers that you're making as well. So remember, you make 8 NADHs and you have 2 FADH2s. So 8 NADH, you got protons in here as well. So 2 protons up here, 8 protons, 2 FADH2s. And all of these guys these guys are going to feed into the whole oxidative phosphorylation. So we got oxidative, this is citric acid cycle. That's phase 2. And then 3 is oxidative phosphorylation. Which is made of 2 things. You got your electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. So these guys are going to be dropping off their electrons over here. In the process, you're going to be making 6 molecules of water for every glucose that goes through here. You're also, now we finally get to make our ATP, and this is where it gets really fun. As those protons get propelled, they're going to go down ATP synthase, cute little barrel guy, and you're going to get 34, at least 34 ATP. So for a grand total of 38 ATP for every molecule of glucose you eat. And so as long as you're breathing and making your body work, this is going to constantly happen. So you got 34 ATP. The numbers are always between 34, 36, 38 for the whole process. I'm giving you the best case scenario that we have here. That, my loves, is cellular respiration. When we finish off this unit, so at this point, I think it's a great time to have a little quiz, a little review on cellular respiration before we get into photosynthesis. That would be the plant side of this. So now that you know this, the plant world is actually going to be pretty easy. So hang in there, we're going to get into photosynthesis, but I'm glad you guys finished off cellular respiration. Good job.